Hello, and welcome back to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and today we are once again perfecting page layout. Today we're talking about systems, specifically the margins and the spacing between the systems. Now there is a lot to cover here, so just don't mind me. I'm going to get right into it. I'm going to go into my page layout tool, and when you select the page layout tool, you will see all of your margins. We talked about the page margins in one of the last videos, but now we're talking about the systems because the systems themselves have margins. As you can sort of see, there's this gray line going across the top of the first system, across the bottom, and you can kind of see the one on the left here until it gets to the bar line. The left margins for the systems and the right margins will align perfectly with the left and right bar lines. This is notable because it does not sort of include the extra information out to the left, including the instrument names and the brackets and everything. They always align with the left and right bar lines. Now, the concept here with these system margins here is that Finale is not going to allow you to overlap system margins. So I'll just show you what's going on here. If I try and drag this system around, you can see if I can drag it to the right as much as I want, it's not going to go past the page margin. I can go the other way too, and it won't go past the page margin, right? The same thing going up and down. The systems themselves will not overlap. It will not allow you to overlap. Except there is an exception to this, which I'm going to get to a little bit later. But that's the principle behind these margins, is that the margins themselves are not allowed to cross each other. The data within the margins, as you can see with some of this music I have here, certainly is allowed to go outside of the margins. So in that regard, the margins are somewhat arbitrary. They're just a setting that's in a specific place relative to the staff. In fact, the bottom margin is a value below the bottom staff line, and the top margin is a value above the top staff line, which I'm going to show you in a second. So that's sort of the theory about what's going on here. So let's actually go into the page layout menu here, and we're going to choose edit margins. Now, this brings up this little edit system margin windows, and it looks a little bit similar to the edit page margin window that I showed you in one of the previous videos. It works a little bit similarly, but I'm going to show you what's going on here. So every system gets a set of values for the top, left, right, and bottom margin, as well as the distance between systems. And you can see those values here. And if I select a different system, you'll see the slightly different values sometimes. And you'll always be able to see which system you're selected here. If you look at the change system 1 through 1, if I choose system 2, it'll say 2 through 2, 4 says 4 through 4. I'm going to show you how you can use this change system through numbers here to affect multiple systems at once. But let's start talking about these values here to start. So if I'm looking at the second system here, you'll see that I have a top system margin value of 0.25. That means that the invisible box that goes above the system here is 0.25 inches above the top staff line of the top staff, whichever staff happens to be on top. Same thing with the bottom, 0.25. They're both positive values, meaning that it's going away from, so going upwards in the top staff, going downwards in the bottom staff. So you can see that the bottom one is set to 0.25, so that means that this invisible line is 0.25 inches below the bottom line of the staff. The left and right margins are slightly different because the left and right margins will always line up with the left and right bar lines no matter what. The values here are actually referencing the distance between the system margin and the page margin. So in the case of the left margin for system 2, you can see that the 0 value here means that it's 0 inches away from the page margin. If I were to select this first system where there's an indentation here, now you'll see that there's a 0.625 value here, which means that this left margin is 0.625 away from the left page margin. Same thing with the right margin. And again, this is all positive numbers, so a positive number here would send this right margin to the left, if you see that. So now we have a gap here of 0.5. Interestingly, you can never have negative numbers in any of these boxes. If you add, well, I shouldn't say that you can, but it's a special circumstance, which I'm going to get to later, I promise. But if you try to put a negative value in the bottom margin, for example, negative 0.25, it will move that margin to the 0 point and just reset that value to 0. So you can't really have negative values here, except for that exception, which I'm going to show you later. The other value in this box that's important is this distance between systems value. And I've got the second system selected here, and you can see it's 0.6. This distance between systems value references the distance between the top margin of the system that you've selected and the bottom margin of the previous system. So if you can see where my mouse is sort of tracing here, it's this distance right here. So this is 0.6 inches, right? It has nothing to do with the top line or the bottom line of each staff. It has to do with that invisible boundary. So if you change this value from 0.6 to, let's say, 0.8, you'll see that that gap will grow larger and your systems will get farther away. If I make this smaller, it will go the other way, right? So that's exactly what's going on there. And if we make this 0, you'll see that my top margin of system 2 will overlap with the bottom margin of system 1. So that's also a possibility. Again, these numbers cannot be negative. If I were to try and put negative 0.6 here, it would just do nothing. It would just put negative 6, but nothing happens here. So you're still set at the 0 point. All right. Again, there is an exception to that, which I'm going to get to later. The other thing to note about this distance between systems value is that when you have a system selected that's in the middle of the page, then this refers to the distance between that system and the previous one. But if you have selected a system that happens to be at the top of the page, then this distance between system values actually references the space between the top margin of the system and the top page margin. So even though there is no system above system 4 in this case, that's what that value is measuring instead. So let's talk about this change system 4 through 4 thing in this case. And again, if you select a single system, it will change that to, say, 2 through 2, 3 through 3, etc. What this little function here allows you to do is it allows you to make changes to more than one system at once. So if I wanted to select systems 4 through 5, I could just do systems 4 through 5. I could also, with my mouse, click on system 4 again, click anywhere in the middle of the system, and you'll see it get highlighted up here, meaning that you have that one selected, and then just hold Shift and select system 6, for example, and you can have systems 4 through 6 selected here just like that. Or again, you could just do this manually, 2 through 7, or whatever it is, 4 through whatever. And if you leave this last one blank, by the way, to finale, this indicates that you want to change systems 4 through the end. And when I do that, you can kind of see all of the systems now are highlighted in that upper left-hand corner handle there. So this is very valuable. You can sort of change a range of systems for any one of these values here. So if I said, let's say change system 4 through 7, and we're going to change this distance between systems from 0.27 to 0.3, just to make it a little bit more spaced out, you'll see that all the systems get a little bit more spaced out, right? Again, we could do that. Let's undo that. We can do that for the whole document, or 4 through the end in this case. And actually, let's shrink it. So we'll make this 0.15, and you'll see all the distances shrink, from system 4 all the way through to the end of the piece. So this is a really nifty, handy little piece of this. Now, let's talk about these check marks. Essentially what these check marks do, and I talked about this in the page margin videos, it works very similarly. What they're doing is it's telling Finale, when you have these options checked, definitely change these values to match the numbers that you're looking at here. Now, in most cases, if your systems are all set with the same margins, 0.25, 0.25, 00, 0.27, if I go down all of these systems, they're all going to be pretty much the same. So if I change one value for all of these systems, it's going to change it there, and it's not going to worry about the rest of it. But there are some circumstances where you may have, like, let's say that this system 4 here is indented, and we do that just by clicking or typing 0.5 in the left margin here, right? So now I've got this indentation here. So if from this point I want to change the distance between system from system 4 to the end, right? We do the same thing here, system 4 through the end, and we want to make it a little bit bigger. We can say 0.3. If I were to do this, you're looking at this window the way that's set up, and you're going to see that this left margin is set to 0.5. So when I click apply, it's not only going to change the distance between system of all these systems, it's also going to enable that left margin to be set at 0.5, which is, in this case, not a desirable result. So these checkboxes actually allow you to sort of deselect that from the process, as it were. So I've got system 4 through the end. I just uncheck the left box, and I'm going to change the distance between system to 0.15. We'll shrink it. And when I click OK, you'll see that everything gets shrunk, or the distance between systems gets shrunk, but the differences in the left margins remain. So, system 4 had a 0.5 left margin. Everyone else had a 0 margin here. So with this unchecked, you're basically leaving that alone. So it's sort of a way of filtering out this change by deselecting certain things. Most of the time, you probably don't need to deal with this, but if you want to be really careful and you know that you only ever want to change the distance between systems, you can just uncheck all these, and then these guys will be left alone until you recheck them. Incidentally, I talked about what happens when the top system tries to go upwards. Like, you can't really go any further than 0 for this distance between systems here. If I were to try and do that, if I put a 0 there, you can see that it would go right to the top. And again, I can't cross that boundary if I try to drag it upwards, or if I try to put a negative number here, it simply won't let me. But I never talked about what happens when you go the other way. When you start increasing the distances between these systems to the point where the bottom system's bottom margin starts to cross over the bottom page margin, right? If I were to drag this way and just keep going, if I were to keep dragging this past here, what you'll see is that system 7 will now get put on the next page. This means that when you start doing this with the numbers too, in the same way that I was showing you, so again, let's just set this up 4 through the end. If I start increasing this distance between value, right, 0.3 is still okay. We're going to get 4 systems on a page. But if I were to really increase this to 0.5, you see that won't be enough room for system 7 to sit here. So now all of a sudden it's going to push system 7 to the next page, and then we're going to end up with 3 systems on a page instead of 4. So that's what happens with the bottom margin. It's slightly different than the top margin, where the top margin, you can't kind of like drag this upwards and expect it to get put on the previous page if there's room. It just doesn't work like that. Incidentally, it does have a little handy required for additional system and then a value here. This is sort of handy because if you start making adjustments in terms of like the distance between the system, the system margins and everything, eventually this number can shrink, and it will tell you that you need this much more room to fit system 8 on the next page, for example. So it's not really going to make much sense right here, but if I were to try and put this system 7 here, you'll see that now for page 2 or 3, really, the only required value that I need for the additional system 7 to be put up onto the second page is 0.25. And you can get there several different ways. Obviously, you can kind of move these up until that 7th system gets put on that second page. So that's just I don't know, I don't know how super useful this is, but it does tell you sort of how far away you are from being able to squeeze another system on the page. And so the last piece of this edit system margin windows, obviously we have the apply here, which you see me do, and every time I make a change, you hit apply and it affects that page or sorry, that system or that range of systems in the way that you've set it up. But there's also this here, apply to parts and score. Now this particular file only has a score. I don't have any linked parts, so you're only going to see score. But if I were to go over to this other orchestral file and choose that apply to parts or score, you'll see my list of parts here. Now this is really, really handy if you're doing some mass operations. Like let's say if I go into my flute 1 part here, and you know what, I'm going to leave page 1 alone, but I've decided that I'm going to change the spacing between systems from page 10 through the end. So what I can do is, just select 10 there, delete that so it's through the rest of the document, right? And again, from here, if I were to do something like, put 0.25 here and click apply, you'll see that it will spread those systems out for this particular part. What's really handy, however, is that if I were to do that 0.25 and choose apply to parts score and check all except score and maybe my piano part, because that's going to be slightly different, and click OK, Now, not only did that apply it to the flute 1 part here, but it applied it to flute 2, it applied it to flute 3 or whatever, oboe 1, whatever this is. So every single part will have that new spacing. So, in one shot, I just changed the distance between systems from the second page all the way through the end to all parts all at once. So that's incredibly powerful and handy to know about if you can kind of use that to your advantage. And again, it doesn't have to be all the parts. You can select specific parts. If you only wanted to make that operation on the flutes, then just select the 2 flutes or whatever. So there's a lot of flexibility here as far as that's concerned. Let's go back to my piano violin score here, though. So now that we've looked at this little edit system margin windows, let's actually go ahead and look in the document menu here in the page format for the score in this case. And again, you have this option for the parts as well. Now there are system margin values that exist in the page format. You can see top, left, right, and bottom. These work exactly the same. They mean exactly the same thing. Same with distance between system. Now, as we know already, the page format for the score, this is the default setting. So when you start adding new systems, those new systems will take on these values. So if you do make a mass change to, say, the distance between systems value here, you might want to go back in here and make sure that this matches. Of course, we can do that if we had the update page format for score. If you do have this checked and you start making changes in this edit system margin window here, that will actually start making changes to the page format and score. So particularly when you're using this edit system margin window to make local changes and everything, just be careful that that option is not checked. Otherwise, these things are going to be changing left and right all the time, which may or may not be desirable. And because again, when you create new systems, it's going to take on whatever this is set to. So if you had made a weird change to one of the systems, then the next system that you create is going to also have those weird changes. There's also this option for the first staff system margin. This allows you to do something special with the first staff system. And in this case, this file has the top margins the same. The left margin has that indentation, so it's 0.625, which is what you're seeing here. And then also a special distance from the top, because again, that distance between systems, when you're dealing with this top system of the page, is actually the distance from top. So that's why it's saying distance from top here, and there's a larger value here of 1.7. So that's this huge value, or this huge gap here on the first page between the top of the first system and the top page margin. So you can set these up however you need to, but again, remember, these are the defaults. Once the pages and the systems have been generated, the systems take on these values, and then from there you can manually adjust them as you need to. Of course, that we can also use this window to make changes as well, in the same way that we've done some of these other things, where we can change the value of the top margin, for example, here, and again, nothing happens until you go to redefine pages, and then all of a sudden that top margin gets a lot larger. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can deal with this. For margins, I like to set this up sort of the way that I like to, and then kind of leave it so that I know that when I create new systems, it's going to have a decent setting to it. But the majority of the time when I'm dealing with systems, I'm dealing with the edit system margins, or I'm dragging them around, which is the next thing I'm about to show you. So the other way that we can adjust the distances and the margins and everything with the systems is manually, by just using the handles here, or actually just grabbing the middle of the system. If you click and hold, you can go ahead and actually drag the system like that, up or down. Again, you can't really drag them left or right because Finale is not going to allow you to cross that page margin with the systems here. So for moving the distances, this is the preferred method as far as I'm concerned, because what this actually does is it literally changes the value here in the edit system margin window for the distance between systems. In fact, you can see when I change this on system 2 that value right there actually changes. So that's what's going on. But we can also use these handles on the upper left corner and the upper right corner to change the margin values as well. So if I were to actually take this upper left one and move it down, what I'm doing is actually decreasing the margin there. And if I move it up, it's actually increasing that margin. And interestingly, it does that while also adjusting the distance between systems. So you're not actually, theoretically, this would change the location of the music relative to the system above, but it doesn't because it's actually sort of changing the top margin and the distance between system at the same time. We can also use this upper left one to move the margin left or right, just like that if we need an indentation. Now when you're doing this, I do recommend holding the shift key, because the shift key, like most other things in Finale, will allow you to restrain the dragging in one direction, so I can only move left and right instead of accidentally moving up and down. So hold down shift if you really want to adjust the left and right value. Now again, things like this I don't prefer to do it this way because it's a little bit imprecise. It's hard to get an exact value. For me, it's much easier to just go in here, change that to 0 or change it to 0.5, and it's, just much easier to do it that way. Same thing happens with the bottom right. Now this will adjust the bottom margin as well as the right margin. So if I move this down, in this case, it moves the bottom margin away from the bottom line of the bottom staff, but it does not adjust the distance between systems. So this is actually yet another way to decrease or increase the distance between the systems. Again, I much prefer to do it this way, where you're actually moving the whole system and then therefore only moving the distance between systems, but to each his own or her own. And of course, we can use that bottom right handle again with shift in this case, just to increase the the margin here, and you can see the result of that here, 0.59. And again, you can't go past the right margin, so you can never accidentally go outside the margin. And so there you go. So that's dragging those handles around. Now I believe you can actually shift click and select multiple margins to move them all at the same time, which you can. You just saw the top margin of both system 2 and 3 here move. So you can move multiple systems at the same time, even moving them all together. So I've got systems 2 and 3. If I grab in the middle of system 2 here, you'll see both systems 2 and 3 move just like that. So that's one way to do it. And then there's one special function. If you hold down the Option key, what you can do is actually move the system without moving the one below it. Because normally without the Option key, moving this distance retains this distance, which means that both of them move together, right? Without the Option key, you can see them both move together, even though they're both not selected. With the Option key, it just kind of leaves that bottom one in place, which means that it's actually changing both the distance here and here. So it's actually changing the distance between systems on systems 2 and on systems 3. So that's good to know. And we can even combine this if you have more than 3. Let's say here, you can select system 5 and system 6, shift click, and hold down Option, and move both 5 and 6 while leaving 4 and 7 together. All right, so that Option drag with the systems like that is a great little thing to know about. Okay, so we're getting there. I know this is a long video, but there's a lot to cover here, and there's just a couple more miscellaneous things to cover here. So let's go back into the page layout tool and look at this system submenu. There's two other options here besides the edit margins. Incidentally, once you have this edit system margin window set up here, it will usually stay there if you go to a different tool, go to a few different tools and then come back. That edit system margin window will appear. Unless you had closed it or something, then obviously it will not appear. If it doesn't appear, you can always go back up into here and choose edit margins, and that little mini edit margin window will appear. But we're looking at some of the other options here, or the two other options here. And the next one is called system space before after music. Now this has some sort of limited uses in my opinion, but what this will allow you to do is select that system there, system 2, system space before or after music, and you can actually choose the system here too, or systems 2 through whatever, to give yourself some extra space at the beginning of the system. So if you put a value in here, let's say 0.5, you'll see that you will actually get a gap between the key signature in this case, or the time signature if there was one, and the start of the music. There is a similar function that that you can do this in with the measure tool, where you can actually add a gap to this measure. The difference between doing it here with the system is that it won't actually matter which measure is at the beginning of the system. When you do it with a measure, then that gap will be attached to that measure, so that gap would appear here instead of here now. So again, it doesn't matter which measure happens to be at the beginning of system 2, it will have that extra gap, if that makes sense. Let me just undo all of that. There we go. The other piece of that is the end, so we can choose some extra space after the music, and if we choose a value here, again, it will go, the extra space will go to the left, so again, all of these values need to be positive. And doing that will put some actually it'll put some space after the bar line, which is interesting. So you can actually have an effect where you have the bar line just sort of continuing on, which could be an interesting thing to do. Or you could choose the sub option there, system 2 through 2. Extra space at the end of system, let's say 0.5 before bar line. So this would actually put that gap before the bar line. So there's actually two different ways to do that there. And again, the same thing applies. I won't show you, but when you put the space at the end of the system like that, it won't matter which bar is at the end of the system. It will always get that extra space. There was another option there in the systems submenu here for select staff system range, and this is just a little utility that tells you, yeah, I want to choose systems 2 through 7, and you click OK, and then it will highlight it for you. So, you know, I guess that can be useful if you're dragging around a little bit, but you know, it's just as easy to, you know, click system 2 and then shift click to select system 7. And of course you can do the same thing here. So there's a little bit of redundancy there, but that option is available if you need it. We also have contextual menus for these systems, and you can kind of right click any of these handles. So I just right click that one, you can right click this one and pulls up the same menu, and you can even right click right in the middle of the system to pull up this contextual menu, and you have, you know, some other options. That's the same thing we just talked about, select system range. We can insert systems, we can delete systems, which is something that I'm going to address at a later video. Same thing with page breaks. I'll address both of these things later. But we can also edit margins, and that would, again, just pull up this window if it wasn't here. So edit margins, there we go. And system space before after music pulls up that window that I just showed you. And then the last option there, or the third to last option there, remove manual adjustments. Now when you select the remove manual adjustments, what it will do is it will remove all of the adjustments for the system margin settings and the distance between systems, and revert it back to whatever happens to be here in the system margin settings for the page format. So again, this is 0.25, 0.25, 0.27. So is that what system 4 is set up to? Pretty much. So if I were to remove remove manual adjustments here, wouldn't do anything. If I were to move this down, if I were to, you know, if I were to indent that a little bit, then by choosing remove manual adjustments, it will reset that all back to that original setting from the page format for the score in this case, or the part if you're dealing with a part. All right, so that's pretty much the options in the contextual menu. Again, I'll talk about inserts and systems and page breaks in a later video. The last thing I want to talk about, I know this video is getting really long, but this is important, is the option in the page layout menu called avoid margin collisions. 99.9% of the time, this option should be checked. But if you uncheck this option, this is where we can get those magical exceptions I was talking about, where now all of a sudden all of these margins are fairly meaningless. So you can indeed move that system so that it crosses over that page margin, which is just insane. And you can get yourself into a lot of trouble with this unchecked, because if you intend to sort of, you know, just move the space there, what you'll see is it's very easy to get the systems a little bit off kilter. Right? It's very easy to get them sort of not aligned with that option unchecked. So you really have to be careful. Of course, you can always use the shift key, which will prevent it from going left or right. But yeah, it will allow you to do some crazy things, including, you know, if you really wanted to, you could actually overlap the systems, which is just weird. And you can do all kinds of weird stuff with this. There is a practical function to this. So I'm just going to show you sort of the main practical reason why this exists. There is actually a plugin for Codas in here. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Right, it's in the measure section. There's a plugin for Create Coda System, which I talked about in the repeat thing, in the repeat category, which kind of takes advantage of this option of turning off avoid margin collisions. What it does, sort of in a more automatic sense, is what I'm about to show you. So let's say I'm going to move this margin all the way over here. Actually, what I should have done is just made this 2 bars. We're going to make this one 2 bars. And then I can take this left margin and drag it all the way over here, right? Now with this avoid margin collisions unchecked, what that will allow me to do is then take this system and drag it up into place besides the previous system, so you can get something like that. And this is exactly how that Create Coda system plugin works. Now it looks like this might be one system that's broken here. It's actually 2 systems, and if you select the page margin or the page layout tool, you can actually see this is system 5 and system 6. It puts the numberings all the way on the left here, so it looks like they're overlapping, but that does say 5 and 6, right? System 5 and system 6. Now without that option checked, with it checked rather, you can't do this. In fact, you can try to, but even though there's plenty of space here and you're not actually crossing margins, Finale considers this trying to cross over the top margin with the left margin, even though they're side by side. It won't allow you to do that. So for doing stuff like this, the only way to do it is to uncheck that and then move that system up side by side, just like that. Now, when you do stuff like this, you do have to be careful because, again, having that option unchecked can be dangerous, because now you can go here and you want to make some other adjustments. You move this down. Again, you can get into that same trouble where you're accidentally moving things left or right. So the thing to do is probably turn this back on. When you turn this back on, as long as you don't move these systems, they'll stay in place. So now you can change these other ones without having to fear going left and right of the page margins. However, if you were to go back and adjust either of these systems, even in the slightest, you'll see it will snap to avoid those margins again. So you just have to be careful about using this avoid margin collisions. Again, this is really the main purpose for having that option unchecked. And then once you set it up, just check it again, and then just be careful not to move those margins. And interestingly, I said the thing about the negative margins. In this case, with this avoid margin collisions unchecked, now you can see, if you actually look at the system margins here, this is actually showing a distance between system value of negative 2.1. So what's happening is that the 0 point for this top margin would be here, but then it's actually going negative above that. So like I said, in this case, you can get negative numbers. In fact, when I actually try and move these systems, too far to the left to cross over the left margin here, now you can see I can get a negative left margin here. So, all of this is, it's kind of weird, but this is exactly what's going on. These negative numbers can only ever exist with that option checked. You can see I can get a negative distance between system value here again by crossing these over. So a lot of stuff going on here with that option. Again, 99.999% of the time, leave that option checked. It's checked by default in your file, so you usually don't have to worry about it. But in case you need to do something like that, that is exactly how. And boom, I think that's it. I think I covered it all. The systems in Finale, there's a lot to it. It seemed weird for me to try and split this video up because everything is so related. So this may end up being the longest video I've created. And if you sat through to the end, good for you. You get a gold star. All right, so yeah, that's it for system margins and spacing. I appreciate you watching and spending the time with me. And come back. The next video I'm going to do is actually on a plugin that's related to this in the scoring and arranging section called Space Systems here. This is actually a sort of function that deals with allowing you to space your systems in a more automatic way if you want to. So come back for that. That's going to be the next video. All right, so once again, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you aren't already, and I will see you soon on the next video.